all so much for joining us for a trip to Istanbul, Turkey with the Traveling Librarian. Join Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for another one of his popular armchair travel presentations. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, journey to the cosmopolitan city of Istanbul, a major crossroads of Eastern and Western civilization. Istanbul is not Turkey's political capital, but it is the country's largest city and cultural hub. Rich with gorgeous Islamic architecture, fascinating markets, and vibrant street life, Istanbul is a city that will amaze you with its opulence. Jeff is the recently retired head of reference services at the Bibi Memorial Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. So all 80 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us this morning. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started right away. And as he said, if anyone has any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll keep an eye on that as we go through. And anything I don't catch, I will answer at the end. So let's get started. There we go. Okay, first, as I usually do in my presentations, I want to kind of put things on the map and give you also a thumbnail history. The history of Istanbul is, of course, millennia long. So I'm going to give you the 60-second version, which is, it is, as mentioned in the introduction, it is not the capital of Turkey. It is actually, it is the largest city, but Ankara, which is in the center of the country, is the capital. Turkey has about 75 million people right now, give or take, overwhelmingly Muslim and mostly Sunni. And Istanbul, or Istanbul in Turkish, is one of the largest cities in the world, believe it or not. You don't necessarily think of it that way. It has 14 million people in it. And that's kind of because of the way different places measure population. The actual municipality of Istanbul is huge, with 14 million people, plus all the people in the surrounding metropolitan area. And it's very old. It was actually founded in the 7th century BC as Byzantium. And I'm sure some of you know at least a little bit of the general sketch of the city history, which is that the Emperor Constantine made it the eastern capital of the Roman Empire when the empire was divided in the 4th century, and he named it after himself, being an egotist, so it became Constantinople, which it is still called by the Greeks. We won't get into the whole Greek-Turkish stuff today, but the Greeks still call it Constantinople, whereas the Turks call it, and everyone else calls it, Istanbul. The next really big event in the history was when the Turks conquered it in the year 1453, when Mehmet the Conqueror came in. He was only something like 19 or 20 years old, but it was one of the major events in medieval history. And it stayed under Turkish control for centuries until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century after World War I. And that brought independence to Turkey as a modern country, the country we know today, under Mustafa Kemal, who's better known as Ataturk, who was the first leader of the modern country. As I said, Ankara is the capital, the political capital, and the second largest city, with about maybe 5 million people. So it's considerably smaller than Istanbul. And Istanbul is by far not just the largest city in population, but in influence. It is culturally and economically, it's the New York of Turkey, as opposed to Ankara, which is the Washington of the country. Part of why it's such an important city, if you can see my pointer here, is its geographic location, which is that it is close to the Black Sea, which is up here, on the Sea of Marmara, which is this small body of water in between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And of course, there are two very important connection points that have been important in various historical events. There's the Dardanelles here, and the Bosphorus, which is what flows by Istanbul. Moving in a little bit closer, you can get a better idea of, again, here's the Black Sea, the Bosphorus Strait moving down into the Sea of Marmara, and Istanbul is right at the bottom on this peninsula. And getting in even closer, you can see this other little side river, which is called the Golden Horn. And that separates the old and the new cities. Much of what we're going to be seeing in today's program is concentrated in the historic center, which is here, a little bit on the Asian side, and a little bit over here in the newer part of the city. The main bridge for crossing the Bosphorus is here. It's one of the few bridges. But you can also cross underneath. In fact, it's the only place in the world where you can take a subway, a metro, to go from one continent to the other. So you can be in Europe in the morning and take the metro over to Asia for lunch and come back if you feel like it. And here again, just zooming in even further, most of the sites that you would be likely to visit as a tourist are in this central district called the Sultanahmet district, where some of the major mosques are, the oldest neighborhoods, and also the Topkapi Palace, which we will look at, in some of the major museums. So we're going to spend much of our time in that area. It's a beautiful city to stroll around. And many people ask me about the city as in terms of safety. And it's kind of an interesting question because in general, Istanbul is a very safe city for tourists. The biggest problem they've had in recent years is terrorism, although that tends not to target tourists. One time it did. You may have heard recently there was an explosion that killed a number of locals in one of the main squares. I certainly would not avoid Istanbul because of those things, at least not for the moment. But in general, Istanbul has no more of the kind of tourist crime than you would expect in any other major city in the world, as long as you take sensible precautions about your belongings and things. It's actually a very wonderful city to stroll around in. And it's very pedestrian friendly, since most of the things that you might want to see are in a relatively small geographic area of the city, including a number of mosques that we're going to look at. The food is incredible. It's a mix of all the different kinds of food that you might imagine meeting in this crossroads kind of country between East and West. So there's a lot of influence from Eastern Europe and Mediterranean cuisine, but also Lebanese cuisine and Iranian cuisine, and all the countries that are that meet in this area all have influenced the cuisine that you'll find in Turkey. And that's true not just of food, but also artwork, architecture, all kinds of things, because it's one of those typical crossroad countries where so many cultures have met over the life of the city and left their mark over time. Here's one of the bakeries. We stayed in a hotel. I've been there 3 times, I think. And here I am lounging in the extremely extravagant front lobby of the hotel that we stayed in, which was quite comfortable and conveniently located right in the middle of the old city, which made it easy to get around. Istanbul has a lot of international style hotels, Hiltons, and all that kind of thing with all the bells and whistles. I tend not to prefer those because they're the same everywhere. And if you go, I would recommend instead trying to find a local guest house, because there are a lot of those and they have so much more character. They're a lot more, they're much smaller, but they're just as comfortable, and they tend to be a lot less expensive. Also, many of the really the big international hotels are not in the best parts of the city for seeing things. They tend to be on the outskirts, and it makes it harder to get to the things that you're more likely to want to visit. We were very close to probably the single most well-known monument in the city, which is Hagia Sophia. This is, even if you were only in Istanbul for a few hours on a cruise ship stop, this is the thing that you should make sure that you see. It's probably one of the most important architectural monuments in the world. It was built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, 537, and it served as a Greek Orthodox church, Eastern Orthodox, until the Ottomans conquered it under Mehmet in 1453, that very important date when he swept in and took the city. From then until the beginning of the 20th century, when Ataturk came in, it was used as a mosque. And then it was turned in the 20th century into a secular museum. Although if you've been following the news at all recently, there was a very controversial decision by the current government. Erdogan has been taking Turkey increasingly to the right, and with his much more autocratic rule over the past 15, 20 years. And very controversially, he returned this back into an active mosque, whereas for so long, for most of the 20th century, it had been a symbol of Turkey's more ecumenical view of the world. And so that caused a lot of consternation in cultural circles around the world. It doesn't mean that you can't visit it anymore. It's still one of the most popular tourist sites in the city, but symbolically that was a big change, and we'll see where that goes. But nonetheless, it is an incredible building, partly because it has served for so long in so many different ways. This I found kind of funny, because here are all these people, these tourists, in the middle of one of the most important monuments on the planet, and they're all taking pictures of the cat with their smartphone and ignoring all of the architecture of it. It really is a spectacular building, because it has a mix of incredibly beautiful Byzantine decoration in it, overlaid with all of this Islamic iconography as well. Many of the early Christian designs were covered over. Some of them were later uncovered. And of course, the minarets were added on the exterior. But it's an incredibly powerful building to be in. And much of the decoration is just gloriously detailed, whether you're talking about the Christian or the Islamic versions. And you can see here a number of the close-ups of some of what look like paintings, but most of what you're seeing here in the gold, all those designs, is actually mosaics, which are incredibly detailed. And it's a massive building. So it definitely, if you've been, for example, to the Vatican or St. Paul's in London, it's on that scale. So it's kind of mind-blowing to walk in and see this enormous interior with incredibly detailed and beautiful designs. They were, when I was there, they were doing a certain amount of construction. So I tried to take all of my photographs aimed away from the scaffolding. But it is important because it has suffered damage over the centuries from earthquakes and settling. So it's very important for them to try and maintain the structure. This particular photograph shows a number of different kinds of marble. There's a mix of real marble and also painted marble. Like, for example, this red stuff here is actually not real stone. It's just painted to look like stone, whereas the stuff underneath is actual marble. Here you can see the scaffolding where they were working on some restoration. You can go upstairs, which gives you an even better view and a better sense of just how large this building is. One of the most important mosaics in the whole building, most historic, is this one here. called the Veisis mosaic, which is from the 13th century. And it commemorates the return to the Orthodox faith, because for a very brief period of time in the early 1200s, it was used as a Roman Catholic church as opposed to an Orthodox church. And then after that short period, I think it was like 20 years or so, it was reconverted back into an Orthodox church. And this mosaic commemorates that event and shows the Virgin Mary with John the Baptist over here and Christ in the center. And despite its bad condition, it's one of the best and best preserved mosaics in the building. And here's a view of the domes on the outside, looking across the main park to the Blue Mosque, which we'll visit in just a minute. This is looking straight up at one of the chandeliers that hangs down from the ceiling. And of course, there are a number of minarets, which were added later after 1453, when it was converted to a mosque. This whole center where Hagia Sophia is, and the Blue Mosque and a number of other important monuments, is called the Sultanate district. And it's not only important for all of those monuments, but just because it's a really good sort of microcosm of old Turkey. It has a lot of old wooden buildings that are typical of the Ottoman Empire over the past couple of centuries, like this one. And a lot of really nice neighborhoods with guest houses that you can stay in, and restaurants and shops and so forth. Here's the sort of confusing exterior of Hagia Sophia, where you can see all the different domes and side chapels that buttress the building. There's also some tombs just on the outside. 5 important sultans from the history of the Ottoman Empire are buried in these tombs that are adjacent around a little courtyard, and you can visit those as well. Green is a very important color for Islam, so you will often find it in buildings and also on tombs, where here the Sultan and his family members are buried in these sarcophagi with green cloths over them. These guys were vacuuming the tombs, and I wondered just how you end up that being your job, where you vacuum the coffins of very important old sultans for your work. The other major monument right across a beautiful park with fountains is known as the Blue Mosque. We're going to go there in just a sec. And these 2 mosques, Hagia Sophia, which you can see here, and the Blue Mosque on the other side, are a beautiful assemblage of 2 very important buildings with this gorgeous park where it's kind of a focal point in the city, right across from each other. And you'll see all kinds of people in the city. It's a very cosmopolitan city, not just today, but throughout history. So despite the fact that it's a Muslim country, despite the fact that it's been kind of shifting rightward in recent years, Istanbul is still very much kind of in between East and West. So you will see plenty of people walking around in very conservative Muslim, different degrees of Muslim garb, like this woman who is completely covered head to foot. Some women will simply wear a headscarf, and other women you'll see walking around in entirely Western business dress, like you would see anywhere else. There are tourists from all over the world, and it is a very polyglot kind of city. There is certainly no need to learn Turkish to go there, because English is widely spoken by almost anybody who would deal with tourists, whether it's a restaurant or a hotel or a shop. English is almost the default language for dealing with most people as a visitor. Here we're looking kind of across the Golden Horn to the Galata district, which we'll visit in a little bit. There's a lot of kind of kitschy tourist stuff there, like here where you can buy magic lamps. But if you like shopping, it is an amazing city. And in addition to the ticky-tacky tourist stuff, there is a lot of really good stuff that you can buy there. And I'm going to take you to a couple of the markets. There is public transit. There's an excellent metro system for going longer distances, and there are trams that go through the city. Certainly, you would be nuts to drive. It's much easier to just walk or take public transit if you want to go anywhere, because it's a very convoluted city, and traffic is just insane. So there's certainly no need to even think about that. The fun part is just walking around the city and enjoying the street life. This kind of unassuming gate here is actually very important. This was the entrance to the Ottoman government under Suleiman the Magnificent, who was another one of the most important figures in the Ottoman Empire. He was a 16th century sultan. And this center of the government for a very long time was known in Western diplomatic circles by its French name, because French was the language of diplomacy for a very long time in Europe. And it was known as the Sublime Porte, the sublime port or door. And this is what they were referring to. So in the same way that we would refer to the White House as a sort of shorthand for talking about the American government, the Sublime Porte, or the port, was how for a very long time people referred to the Ottoman government, the Sultan, and his government. Nowadays, this is nowhere near as important. It actually is just the offices of the governor of Istanbul, although that's still important. Some typical Ottoman architecture in this neighborhood. One thing that a lot of people miss, and I would encourage you to go, if you have the opportunity to go there, right in the center of the city, very close to Hagia Sophia, in fact, is an underground site which a lot of people don't necessarily find out about. It's called the Basilica Cistern, and it's a fascinating place to go, literally under your feet. And it was also built by Justinian, who built Hagia Sophia. And it's a cistern for water. It was the water supply for the city. It holds 2.8 million rather cubic feet of water. It's no longer used as a primary water source, but now it's actually an archaeological site. So you can descend quite a ways underground, where you will find this amazing ocean of columns that are probably a good 50 feet high. And it still has water in it, but right now it's only about 3 or 4 feet of water. But you can walk through the columns, which are atmospherically lit. You can dress up like a sultan and have your picture taken if you want to do something touristy. But more importantly, it's just the engineering behind this is quite impressive. And you can see all of these Corinthian columns that are holding up the arches. This is, again, literally right under the streets of the city, and was used to supply the city. Many of the columns use old Roman ruins, pieces of Roman ruins, as part of their construction. In fact, here, these are 2 heads of Medusas that were used as the bases of a couple of columns. And because it's so dark and atmospherically lit, it really is quite an impressive sight. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you have a chance. Also in this same area are a number of other very ancient monuments. This is a 35-year-old Egyptian obelisk that was brought in the 4th century when the city was first established by Constantine from Egypt, from the city of Karnak. And it still holds an important place in the midst of this long park, which is a sort of very long linear park that if you look at it from the air, it looks like almost like it used to be an old chariot racing site, and that's because it was the original Roman. What's the word I'm trying to think of? It's not an amphitheater, but you know what I mean. Very long and skinny, and they would have chariot races around it and other athletic events during the Roman period. And the ruins are long gone, but the shape still exists, and it is now a pedestrianized public area right in the middle of the city. Hippodrome is the word I was trying to think of. I like Istanbul partly just because it's one of those cities where there's so much street life around you. And some of that is locals, a lot of that is tourists, but it's just a great place to just stroll around and see people talking, buying, selling. And the architecture is just so much fun because you can see all different eras. There are so many layers of history in the city. The neighborhood very close to where we were has a number of these old wooden Ottoman style buildings that often have bay windows kind of hanging out to get, this is a way of getting more air during the hot summer months. And many of them have been restored into very nice guest houses that you can stay in. And it's right along the Bosphorus, so the views are amazing. The Bosphorus is full of boat traffic, as you might imagine. This, what I thought was an art installation. So I took this kind of artsy photo looking across the river, turned out to be just a place where a bunch of guys had hung up balloons so that they could do target practicing on them. But it was still kind of fun to see. You can see across the river what we're looking at on the other side is Asia. The Asian side, which not too many tourists go to visit, but it is a very nice part of the city. A little bit more of the atmosphere of daily life in the city rather than the touristy part. But you can see shipping going by constantly on the river between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This is the Blue Mosque, which is the other one, the other big monument that I mentioned. It is officially known as the Sultan Ahmet Mosque for its builder. Was built in the early 1600s. And it has 6 minarets, which was considered very improper at the time because that's the number of minarets that the mosque at Mecca had back in the day. And it was considered kind of egotistical to build something that competed with the mosque in Mecca. So in Mecca, they added a 7th minaret in order to counteract that problem. But this is another mosque that is absolutely worth visiting. It is known as the Blue Mosque, not because of the exterior, which isn't blue at all, but the interior, which has 20,000 ceramic tiles. This is not mosaic and not painting. These are all mosaic tiles, ceramic tiles, most of which were made in a nearby city called Iznik. And the overall color scheme is generally blue. It's an enormous interior, even bigger than Hagia Sophia, and was designed by a protege of a very important architect called Sinan. We'll come back to him a little bit later. He was the main architect during the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. So there are many buildings throughout Turkey, and particularly in Istanbul, that were built by Sinan. And one of the people who learned under him was the designer of this mosque. In general, in Istanbul, mosques are open to non-Muslims, and it's quite common for people to go and visit them. The only restrictions would be you do have to take off your shoes, and you do have to be dressed appropriately, which means for men, long pants and not tank tops and that kind of clothing, modest clothing in general. And women do have to wear a headscarf to go in, and they do limit visits to times when prayer services are not taking place. But other than that, you are welcome to go in and visit. And it's worth it to visit a number of different mosques in the city, because they were built in different time periods by different designers, and there's a surprising variety of the decoration that you'll see in different mosques. But this is certainly one of the best known and the highlights. You can see here, this is one of the 4 main columns that holds up the interior dome. You can see just how huge it is. It's probably 20 feet in diameter. But the detailed ceramic tile is just incredible. And as I said, mostly blue. You can buy a lot of these tiles, modern versions that are still made by craftsmen in the country. And they're very beautiful. So that's one of the common things that people will buy to bring home. As you go in, there's a place where you can leave your shoes and pick up a headscarf if you happen to need one. I liked this because the English kind of reminded me of someone with an Italian accent saying, "Please do not leave here your plastic bags." And again, just some street scenes around the city where you can see the incredible variety of people. It's a relatively tolerant city for different levels of religious observance and different cultures coming together, which it has been for a very long time. Lots of great restaurants. We ate in this particular one just because I liked the food. The waiters were friendly. And it was on this very busy corner, so you could see a lot of life going by, a lot of traffic and commotion as you were eating. This is another one of the mosques, which you can see is very different inside. This is just outside the Grand Bazaar. Has a much more austere interior without all of quite the same kind of decoration. This was the view from the roof terrace of the guest house we stayed in, where you could have breakfast and see the whole capital spread around you, or not capital, cities spread around you. The other top site to see, particularly if you're only there for a short time, is the Topkapi Palace, which was used for 400 years from roughly the 15th to the 19th century. And there are several different courtyards that you work your way through. It's now a museum. As you go through this, which is called the Gate of Salutation, it takes you to the next interior courtyard. Just to give you an idea of how it's organized, that's the gate I was just talking about. So you go through this first gate, and then there's a second gate that goes into here, and another one that goes into here. And successively, as you go through these different portals, it becomes more private. This is where the Sultan used to live, the Sultan and his harem, and all of the thousands of people who worked to support the lifestyle of what essentially was an enormous government complex. The harem is over here. We'll visit that in just a sec. You could spend probably a full day just exploring this one place. This tower that you can see here behind the trees is called the Divan Tower, where the Imperial Council of the Sultan met, in the building down at the bottom. But the displays they have in this museum are incredible. There's you can see the kitchens, all of the public staterooms. You can tour the harem, and of course, the incredible detail, over-the-top detail with ceramic tiles and painted decorations and stained glass and so forth. This is the audience chamber, which was built in the 16th century. So this is where visiting dignitaries coming from other cultures would come and have an audience with the Sultan. There's also, this building was built a little bit later in more of a neoclassical style, and this was the library where a lot of the archives of the Sultan were kept. It's a fountain and just views around the courtyards. This whole complex is built high on a bluff that overlooks the Bosphorus, right where the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus come together. So it's a particularly beautiful spot high up where you can get views in three directions, basically. Way at the end is a much more recent addition from, I believe, the 18th or 19th century pavilion. It's now turned into a restaurant. But they also have a museum that has a lot of the equivalent of the crown jewels, essentially, including lots of gifts that were given to the Sultan over the years. As you look up the river, not river, up the Bosphorus, you can see the main bridge, vehicle bridge across the river. Here's that 19th century sort of kiosk style building again, way out at the tip, which has this beautiful terrace. There's a host of different pavilions that were used for different purposes throughout the area, including this one, which was simply a place where people, the Sultan and his family, could go and be cool. It was designed to take in the breezes off the water and eat ice cream, which I would love to have a building like that in my yard. There's also some of the large pools, which nowadays are either empty or have water, but it's worth noting that back in the day, some of these pools that you can see, some of which are connected to the harem, which we'll see in just a minute, were filled not with water, but with milk, because milk was supposed to be much nicer for the complexion of the many numerous women in the harem who bathed in it. That sounds kind of poetic and interesting, except when you imagine what milk sitting out in the sun must have smelled like. In real life, it was actually not as glamorous as you might think. And again, some more pavilions and just pictures of a lot of the details. The view in one direction, you look out over the Bosphorus, and the other, you look north to the more modern city across the river, which we'll go to later, where you can see a number of skyscrapers and more modern structures. The detail is just mind-blowing. There isn't a square meter of surface that doesn't have some sort of decoration. I did just notice in the chat, someone was asking what's the difference between mosaic or ceramic tiles. Basically, the difference is, well, two. One is the size. Mosaic pieces tend to be very tiny and put together in very intricate detail designs, with each piece having its own color. The other is, whereas ceramic tiles tend to be larger, like you can see here, these could be 9 to 12 inches across, and are created in a different way with the design baked into the ceramic. The other difference, I think, is that in most cases with mosaics, the individual mosaic pieces could be any number of different kinds of substances. They might be little pieces of ceramic, but they could also be glass, they could be gold, they could be metal, they could be precious stones, they could be whatever was available and needed to create the design that people wanted. Whereas ceramics are pottery. They are with painted on and fired designs, and usually in much larger pieces, like you can see here. Someone also asked, can you determine any of the craftsmen who designed the tiles? That's a good question, because in a number of cultures in Europe, the stonemasons and other craftsmen would often sign or stamp their works. So you could tell, if not the individual person, you might know the craft shop that or guild that the pieces came from later on. And I don't honestly know whether that's true. I think nowadays, if you buy tourist modern reproductions of these tiles, they are usually signed by whoever made them. Whether that's true for the ones that were used centuries ago, I don't honestly know. That's an interesting question, but I'd have to look into it. It would certainly make sense. Marble columns with different kinds of stone from around the world. A very interesting part of this whole museum complex is the palace kitchens, which are enormous. You can see each one of these weird looking chimney things is in fact a chimney, and it surmounts an individual kitchen, and this was designed to take all of the cooking smoke and fumes out the roof. And they've turned this whole section into, in recent years, they redid this whole part of the museum complex into a really excellent display of daily life in the Sultan's, what it would have been like to live in this complex with, as I said, literally thousands of people, not just the Sultan and his family and his harem and all of the political hangers-on, but also the enormous number of workers that had to keep this place going. There's parts of the Topkapi that were set aside for the guards, which were known as the Janissaries. These were elite guards, often taken from other, taken as captives from other cultures in wars, and turned into the fighting force that was specifically to protect the Sultan. There's a number of bath areas where you can see the traditional Turkish style baths, which had these interesting dome ceilings that let light come streaming through. There's a number of places in the city where you can still do that, where they had public baths for the general public, and many of them are still operating where you can go as a visitor. And I would highly recommend that if you have a chance, because it's a great experience. The harem is a separate kind of, it always was separate, and even today it requires a separate ticket to get in. But just to give you an idea of how labyrinthine it was, it has literally hundreds of rooms and multiple layers. This is just one floor, to give you an idea of how complicated the layout is. It was limited, access to the harem was limited only to the Sultan and his wives, many of them, and concubines, and a woman known as the Valid Sultan, who would have been the Sultan's mother, along with various high-ranking princes and eunuchs who were allowed to serve in this part of the complex. It's probably the most highly decorated part of the Topkapi. Here you can see the Imperial Hall with the Sultan's throne, incredibly detailed decorations, with even baccarat crystal in some areas. It's really just, it's mind-blowing. There's even a lot of stained glass. Most of what you're seeing was 16th century or later, so this is not medieval. And much of it was designed along with other places in the city because the sultans were at that time starting to emulate the other powerful European cultures that they saw, the French, the British, the Germans, and so forth, in an attempt to put themselves on a par with these powerful European powers. So they often tried to emulate the styles and the architecture and the culture of those places, and build things that looked a little bit more Western than would have been true in earlier centuries. There are even some painted decorations here. And it's just an incredible maze of rooms. This particular room, I shouldn't have zipped right over that. This room had the dubious distinction of being the circumcision chamber. Ottoman Turkish men were circumcised, still are today. And in fact, unlike many other cultures that do it at birth or shortly after, in this tradition, it's done as they reach maturity, usually in their early teens, which as a man, you know how that would imagine a teenage boy would feel going through this kind of thing. Not only is it in, you can actually see these kinds of things around the city. There are stores that sell, in fact, I think I have a picture of one. There are stores that sell, it's a big public ceremony, the equivalent of a bar mitzvah or a confirmation for a young Turkish boy who comes of age, essentially. But to have this big, embarrassing public family ritual, and also to be circumcised when you're a grown-up is kind of an unusual concept that we're not really used to, but it still happens in Turkey today. Another nice reason for visiting this palace is the views that you get from it looking across the city to many of the other sites around, particularly the other mosques. The street life is incredibly busy. Lots of the city is pedestrianized, which is nice. Full of people, full of restaurants, full of cafes. And here is the gate that takes you into the Grand Bazaar, which is another highlight to visit if you're there. One of the mosques nearby. The Grand Bazaar started, it's one of the oldest shopping malls in the world, I guess you could say. It started in the 15th century, completely covered, and there are literally thousands of shops. I think they said somewhere around 3,000 individual shops, many of which are tiny. They're nothing but little stalls. There are 60 streets, if you will, inside, and all completely covered by these arches. You can get completely lost in it, which is fun, just to wander around. And they have everything from food, clothing, household goods, and all kinds of crafts and things that tourists might be interested in. There's whole sections with spices, fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, the whole thing. I'm a big fan. I don't actually do a lot of shopping when I travel, but I do love local markets. Those somehow are fun to me, particular street markets, even if I have no intention of buying anything. I love this one. They have a number of different kinds of herbs and spices, cinnamon sticks here, including something called chili for mother-in-law, which I guess is supposed to be very spicy. And even something up here called Viagra tea. Whether it works or not, I have no idea. Here's another, just an example of some of the street life. And in general, it is, as I said, a fairly safe place to walk around. At nighttime and in certain areas, I might be a little bit more careful. But during the daytime, as long as you're a little bit conscious of pickpocketing, which can sometimes be a problem in crowded areas, it's really, it's actually a very safe place to travel. And it's fun to just explore all of these local neighborhoods where everything is for sale and the streets are full of people. And there's all these interesting old buildings to look at. You could wander for hours in the market, the bazaar, even if you're not actually buying anything, just to explore and see the kinds of things that are for sale. There's also, of course, plenty of stuff to eat. This is a kebab shop. which, judging from the incredible line at lunchtime, must be one of the more popular ones in the city. And there's lots of people who will be sitting around playing backgammon or chess and discussing politics and drinking coffee or tea. Because some of the streets are so narrow, it's hard to get trucks, delivery trucks, in and around parts of the city. So you will actually see people like this who are just making deliveries like our UPS guy or our Amazon driver, but they're doing it this way because it's the only other way to get around in the streets. Nearby in this area is another of the most important mosques in the city, although a lot of people don't get to it because they're focusing on the others. This is the Suleimani Mosque, which is the imperial mosque built for Suleiman the Magnificent by Sinan, the architect that I mentioned, who was sort of his court architect. And it is the largest mosque in Istanbul, and well worth visiting just because it has some important tombs, and it was built in such a short period of time that it has a very homogeneous look to it. And it hasn't changed much over time. It also has an amazing view over the Golden Horn. A beautiful courtyard as you enter. And you'll see the interior is actually quite a bit different. It's much more simple. Most of what you're seeing here is not mosaic, it's not ceramic tile, it's actually just painted. It was damaged by an earthquake and a fire in previous centuries. So some of the original design has been lost, but it's still quite beautiful. It seemed to me much more serene than some of the other mosques that you go in. And again, most of what you see here is actually painting rather than ceramic or mosaic work. Most mosques will also have a place at the entrance where observant Muslims will wash their feet before entering. And even visitors who are non-Muslim you wouldn't be expected to wash, but you will be expected to take off your shoes when entering the mosque. But observant Muslims will always wash their feet before entering. And another highlight to this particular mosque is the cemetery, which is just outside, and the tombs, which include Suleiman himself and his wife Roxolana, who's a fascinating person. I would recommend finding some biographies about this time period, because the life, not just the political life, but the personal life of the Sultan and his wives and all of that is really fascinating. Roxolana was an interesting character. And a number of the other imperial family members are buried here. And the cemetery, if you've never seen a Muslim cemetery, the design is obviously completely different. Not only are they using Arabic letters on the stones, but the style of the stones is just so different from a Western Christian cemetery that it's just really beautiful to walk around. You'll see many of them even have a turban, what looks like a turban on the top, and that's usually for where the deceased was someone fairly high-ranking in society in some way. And different styles from different time periods. Just some more pictures of the streets and the traffic. This is a good example of why you should never attempt to rent a car in Istanbul. If you head down the hill from where we just were, and it is quite a hill, you go down these little narrow streets and head through the crowds towards the Golden Horn, you'll come to another one of the major markets, the Spice Bazaar, which is a smaller version, similar in design to the Grand Bazaar, but just much smaller. But it is focused exclusively on food. There's no there's no touristy stuff and crafts and things like that. It's almost all spices and foodstuffs. So here's a place that has nothing but Turkish delight, all kinds of pastries. Many of the Turkish sweets are made with nuts and fruits and sesame seeds and honey and rose water and typical Mediterranean style ingredients. And of course, an incredible array of different kinds of spices, which are displayed in the most beautiful ways. If you like Turkish delight, you can eat your fill of it in any flavor you could possibly imagine. They also sell scents in this particular area. So you can buy perfumes, you can even make up your own perfume with different ingredients. And they have dried flowers that you can use for potpourri, for scenting your drawers and stuff. There's nuts, peppers, olives, you name it. So this is another fantastic place to just wander around and see. It's almost like a food museum. And olives. I'm a big fan of olives, of course, and you can try innumerable different kinds and flavors from all over. It's right next to a mosque that is ironically called the New Mosque, even though it's still several centuries old, but compared to some of the other mosques we've seen, it was built later. And it's in a plaza right next to the Golden Horn, across from the Spice Bazaar. And I love the exterior of it. It's covered with all these domes that gradually rise up to the central one. You may have heard of this place. The pudding shop opened in 1957, and for a long time, it was kind of for tourists and expats back in like the 60s and 70s, it was considered the countercultural place to go and hang out. It was made even more famous by the movie from the late 70s called Midnight Express. I don't know if any of you saw Midnight Express. It's a good movie. And there are some very important scenes that take place in the pudding shop. Now, these days, it's a little bit more of a tourist destination, but the food's still good. And it's kind of fun to be able to say you went there. There's all kinds of, as I said, tacky tourist stuff that you can do. You can get your name written in calligraphy. It's even cheaper than beer. But I prefer to avoid a lot of that and just look at the more traditional design that's everywhere you look in the city. There are just, it's an incredibly photogenic place. Where just strolling around is part of the fun. You will also hear several times throughout the day the call of the muezzin from the minarets, which obviously lends a very Eastern atmosphere to the place, particularly for those of us who are from Western cultures where that just isn't a thing. For us, it's church bells. For them, the call of the muezzin from the top of the minaret is a very important way of marking the different times of prayer during the day. Nowadays, it's usually done by megaphones rather than just an individual person. But hearing that across all of the city is just a magical experience. And particularly as the sun goes down and they light up many of these monuments. We ate dinner way up high at a rooftop restaurant, which is great because then you get a view of the whole city around you as the sun goes down and all the lights start to come on. Even the Topkapi Palace is lit up. You can see all the chimneys and towers of the palace I mentioned food a lot. Turkish food is delicious and very, very hearty and very healthy because they use a lot of local and seasonal ingredients, even in the city. I have no idea what roasting shepherd was. We can try that. Some other parts of the city to stroll around these are not the typical tourist areas, but there's still some really nice things to see. This is the post office. And another one of the fancy hotels. And as you get down to the river, there's plenty of places where you can take boats. And I would highly recommend that just for fun. You don't need to take an expensive tourist boat ride. In fact, there are all kinds of cheap ferries that are part of the public transit system. So for only $1 or two, you can take a boat that takes you across the Bosphorus to the Asian side, where you get just the same kind of feeling of a river cruise for a fraction of the cost. There are lots and lots of both long distance. It's very popular. There are tourist boats that will take you up to the Black Sea. They will take the whole length of the Bosphorus to go take you up to the Black Sea and come back down again. But many of the boats that I'm showing you here are just they're ferries that get locals from one part of the city to the other, and they cost almost nothing. I mentioned also there is a metro system, which is a good way to get longer distances around the city. But because Istanbul is essentially a maritime city and always has been, so seeing it from the water is kind of an important experience to get a feel for what it looks like from the way so many people have seen it throughout history, is arriving by boat. And it's quite beautiful from that point of view. This is the Galata Bridge, which is a 2-level bridge that has restaurants, mostly fish restaurants, on the lower level and traffic on the top. It's also a very popular place for locals to go fishing. And it crosses the Golden Horn from the oldest part of the city to the newer part. The bridge that we're on right now is actually the 4th bridge. The first one was built, I think, in 1912, and then it burned. In fact, the first time I visited Istanbul was not long after it had had a major fire, and that was a huge problem because this is like having the Tobin Bridge burn down. It's a hugely important way of getting from one part of the city to the other. So for many years, the traffic was a disaster until they replaced it. So there were 2 years while all that was happening. And then the current bridge opened in 1994, more or less as a reconstruction of the old one. You'll see a lot of cruise ships in this area as well. Istanbul is a really big cruise ship destination for Eastern Mediterranean cruises. They will often start somewhere, like they'll go from Venice to Istanbul, stopping in various places along the way. So if you like boats, this is a great part of the city to hang around in. Looking across to that newer part of the city, you can see it's a very different atmosphere. Most of the buildings are much newer, although I kind of liked all the colors. And taking a ferry up and down the Golden Horn is also a lot of fun to get from one part of the city to the other. I did find this bridge. This is another of the bridges over the Golden Horn, and it oddly has a metro station. The glass covered thing that you can see in the middle is one of the metro stops, because the metro does actually cross here on the bridge. What I found odd was that rather than having the metro stop at one end of the bridge or the other, it's smack in the middle, which is kind of unusual. We headed up took a ferry up the Golden Horn to visit a lesser visited part of the city. There's a big Orthodox church and university here. And here along the way, you can see this is the old bridge, the Galata Bridge that burned about 30 years ago. They took it away in pieces, and some of the pieces are still there. There's also a fun museum to see. This is particularly if you're traveling with children. It's a museum of transportation, so it has right along the river, it has cars and boats, and even what you can see here is this is actually an American submarine from World War II. So it's just a sort of random mix of old, different kinds of transportation. The reason we went up to this part of the town is I wanted to see this neighborhood that's a bit off the beaten track, and it's right along the old medieval city walls, part of which still exist. And it's a mix of, it's a kind of poor section of the city, but there's also some more renovated buildings like the ones that you can see here as it gets a little more gentrified. Here you can see definitely a mix of new and old, but it's an area that relatively fewer tourists would bother to go to. The reason we went there, partly to see, you can see here some of the original city walls that protected the oldest part of Istanbul from the west. The main reason we wanted to go, or I wanted to go, was to see this church. And this is not actually my photo. This is a stock photo, because when we were there, it was completely covered with scaffolding for renovations. But this is what it would look like without the scaffolding. This is called the Hora Church. It was going under a multi-year project of restoration. And it's one of the most important Byzantine monuments in Europe. And if you are at all interested in Byzantine art, particularly mosaics and frescoes, it's an absolutely fantastic place to see. It's not a big church. And the original church was built outside the city walls in the 5th century AD. And the name reflects that. Hora is a Greek word meaning village, and the idea was that this was a church that was not in the city, but in a village outside the center of the city. The current building dates from the 11th century, and gradually over the centuries, Istanbul expanded and absorbed the neighborhood that this was in, and so the walls are now outside that. But it has some of the world's best Byzantine mosaics and frescoes that you will see anywhere. And even though they were doing work on the exterior, the interior was still visitable, and it's just incomprehensibly beautiful. You have to like Byzantine art, but even if you don't, it's just the mosaics are in excellent condition. And there's a side chapel. There are actually two, it's kind of two basilicas stuck on each side of each other. And one is full of mosaics and the other is full of frescoes, which you can see here. So this is paint as opposed to mosaic. And they are in, considering their age, they are in absolutely incredible condition. Many of the mosaics have gold in them as well, like you can see here, including this particularly beautiful section. So it's kind of an out of the way attraction, but if you like this kind of art, it really is an incredible place to visit. And the neighborhood is pretty as well. It's another, like Hagia Sophia, it's another place where the current government under Erdogan turned this, it was a mosque for a long time, like Hagia Sophia. And then in 1958, it became a secular museum, like Hagia Sophia was. And similar to Hagia Sophia, the current government has reconverted it into a religious use for Muslims, which, like Hagia Sophia, caused a great deal of controversy in the world of international culture, because it really signals an anti-ecumenical view that the Turkish government had held for much of the 20th century. But you can still visit it. And like I said, sometimes I just like to walk around neighborhoods that are not the typical tourist ones. This one, you know, there's nice buildings, there's cruddy buildings, and there's people with dish antennas all over their houses. This is a real city where people live, so you find all kinds of things there. Back down the Horn to the Galata Bridge. This is a better view from the boat, where you can see the two levels of the bridge. You can stroll along whichever level you want, but the lower one is nothing but one fish restaurant after another. Lots and lots of seafood. Exploring this side of the newer side of the Golden Horn, though, is also interesting. It has a very different personality, very much more 19th century than the oldest part where we've been up till now. There's even a synagogue in this new part of the city. And the big monument to see there is the Galata Tower, which was built actually by the Italians, the Genoese, not the Ottomans, in 1348 and 1348, sorry. And it's a couple hundred feet tall, and you can climb that and get an excellent view of this part of the city as well. One of the main shopping streets of Istanbul is here. It's called Independence Street, Istiklal, and it runs for, oh God, at least a mile from the tower all the way up to Taksim Square, which is one of the big modern meeting points in the city. And it's mostly pedestrianized. There's a tram that runs up and down streetcars, but other than that, it's all pedestrianized, and just a great way to see modern Turkish life. Here you can see the old-fashioned streetcar running up and down. It's as I said, it's a much more 19th century feel to it. So it looks more like a Western European city. There's a lot of these old gallery style little side malls with shops in them. Much of the architecture has more of the feel of Western Europe. And when you get to the other end, there's Taksim Square, which is rather new and ugly. You can see it's surrounded by some of the modern international hotels. But it's an important square symbolically for the city, because it has the monument of, it's sort of the heart of the modern city. It's like City Hall Square, City Hall Plaza here in Boston. If you hear on the news of some kind of major demonstration or rally in Istanbul, chances are it's probably taking place here. In fact, there was a bombing here not too long ago, only a few weeks ago. I remember hearing in the news, and it took place here. So it's a very different atmosphere from the old city, but it gives you a better sense of modern Turkey, where Istanbul will come together today. And it doesn't have quite the same old-fashioned feel to it. There's a lot of modern architecture around it, but it is a very nice. There's a lovely park. If you stay in a lot of the international hotels, the big fancy Hiltons and so forth, many of them are in this part of the city. And that's kind of why I wouldn't recommend it, just because it doesn't have definitely doesn't have the cachet and atmosphere. And it's a little off to the side, so it takes longer to get to the things you might want to see. If you can afford it, you might want to stay at the Parapala Hotel, which is here. Even if you can't afford it, it's worth going in for tea. This is probably the Grand Hotel, the Grand Dame Hotel of Istanbul, that opened in 1895. Lots of famous people have stayed there over the years, like Agatha Christie and Greta Garbo and Winston Churchill, and all those kinds of people. Partly because for many Europeans, this was the end of the Orient Express. If you took the Orient Express train and got all the way to Istanbul, this is probably where you stayed at the end. It was the first building in the city to have electricity and an electric elevator and hot running water, not to mention that it's incredibly luxurious inside. They have an excellent restaurant, which even if you're not staying there, they have a tea room and a restaurant and cafe. So even if you're not a guest, you're welcome to wander around the public rooms to get a feel for what it's like and have a drink or a pastry and some coffee and tea. I'd also recommend a book, which I think is pretty well available in many libraries in the area, called Midnight at the Para Palace. And if you're at all interested in the history of the city, particularly not so much the political history, but the social history, it talks about the birth of modern Turkey and modern Istanbul from roughly the late 18th century through the end of the Ottoman Empire and into the 20th century, but kind of seen through the lens of this particular hotel and the important place that it held in the city. It's the author's name is Charles King, and it's called Midnight at the Para Palace. And if you like social history, I really would recommend it. It was a very enjoyable story. Another thing that you can do that's popular for tourists in Istanbul is to see whirling dervishes. And there are two ways to do that. One I would recommend and one I would not. There are a number of places where you can have dinner and see whirling dervishes while you eat your dinner. And that's a very sort of tacky, touristy, belly dancey kind of way to do it. And I would not recommend that. It is worth it to take the time to seek out one of the actual dervish lodges that still exist in the city. This is one of the main ones called the Galata Mevlevi Lodge, one of the oldest of the 6 that remain in the city, 6 active ones. It dates to 1491, in fact. And you may have to book a few days ahead to make sure that you get a spot. But the difference in this experience is that this is more like a religious service, which is actually what whirling dervishes are doing. There's a cemetery attached to this particular lodge. And ubiquitous stray cats, of course. The idea behind a whirling dervish is that they are part of the Sufi sect of Islam. And for a long time, that sect was banned and could only continue as essentially like a cultural exhibition. The ban had since been lifted, although who knows whether that's going to change under the current government. But this is not just an art form, it is actually a religious service. And so being able to attend one that isn't just a dinner show is very important because it really is a religious ceremony. It involves prayer, it involves music, it involves dance. And it's explained when you attend how the whirling, the spinning of the dancers symbolizes a lot of different cyclical parts of life and the universe, including the cycle of the planets and the cycle of the seasons and so on and so forth. So the dancers who, if you've ever tried to do this, you may think it looks easy. Try spinning. Just put your hands up and stand in your living room and try and spin with your hands in the air for more than a minute or two. And you'll see just how incredibly difficult it is. And they will do it for literally 10, 15 minutes at a time. It's a very moving experience. And like I said, this is not a show. This is actually a religious service. And you will get a pamphlet that explains what the symbolism of all these different parts of it are. And I cannot recommend highly enough finding a way to do this, because it's just a really emotionally moving experience. Here's looking across the Golden Horn back to the Topkapi Palace, just some more scenes around the city. If you like photography, Istanbul is a fantastically photogenic place to go. Between the architecture and the street life and the people and the colors. Around every corner, you'll find monuments that are not the big important monuments of the city, but still exquisitely beautiful, like this one. This is known as the Vilayet Mosque. And I just love it because it's got this unusual candy stripe look to it. Even the old train station, which is where the Orient Express would have originally ended up, has this look to it. And again, along the newer part of the city, you'll see lots and lots of cruise ships that stop there. Often it's the beginning of a cruise. Cruises often either end or begin in Istanbul. And if you were to do that, I would definitely recommend adding a couple of days on so that you have some more time to see the city. I think 2 or 3 days is enough to see the highlights, but give yourself, if you gave yourself at least 5, that would really be even better because there's so much to see there. Including, if you have a little bit of time, take either the metro or the ferry across the river to the neighborhood called Üsküdar, where there are several lovely mosques and a nice sort of neighborhoody feel. Very few tourists bother to go over to this side of the city, but there's lots of nice things to see. And it's a bit more of, because it's not crowded with tourists, it just gives you a better feel of what the average Istanbuli lives like. There's a great fish market there as well. Lots of people fishing along the river. And the view back across the river to the old part of the city is beautiful. There's a really nice and very long promenade along the Bosphorus here. You can see Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque across, and the Topkapi Palace. The thing in the foreground, kind of on this little island in the middle of the Bosphorus, is called the Maiden's Tower, also known as Leander's Tower. Very old, built almost 1,000 years ago, although what you're seeing now is actually a more recent version from the 1700s. There's a legend that says an emperor, back when it was originally built, one of the Byzantine emperors, put his daughter there because he had a prophecy. He was trying to avoid the prophecy because the prophecy said that she would be killed by a snake on her 18th birthday. So he sequestered her in this tower to keep her safe. But she died anyway because on her birthday, he took the boat over and brought her a basket of fruit. And unbeknownst to him, there was a snake inside hiding in the fruit, and it bit her and she died. Whether this is true or not, we don't know, but it makes a great story. The other legend associated with it is that of Iro and Leandros, who died. They were lovers. He died swimming across to be with his beloved. That's a very old Greek legend, myth. And this really has absolutely nothing to do with them. But again, it's a nice story. Nowadays, you can take a boat out there if you want, just to see what the tower looks like. And it's most commonly used. There's a trendy cafe there, and it's also a big popular site for weddings. If you have a little extra time and like giant palaces, you could visit the Dolmabahce, which is a 300-room palace that stretches for like, oh God, quarter of a mile along the Bosphorus on the European side, and was built in the 19th century very deliberately to emulate European style, German, Austro-Hungarian, French style palaces, to show that the Ottoman Empire was competing on a par with Western culture. So you can see this is very definitely not an Eastern style look to it. It's full of baccarat crystal chandeliers. It has a whole staircase made of baccarat crystal. So if you like that kind of over-the-top decoration, it's I wouldn't say it's a no miss, but it's a lot of fun just as a slightly different thing to see in the city. One of the highlights of it is the big ballroom, which is actually this very large thing in the center, which is one giant room. It is, in fact, I think the largest ballroom, the largest single ballroom anywhere in Europe, and deliberately built to one up everyone else. And it's so big that, in fact, if they had events there, they had to start heating it days in advance because it took so long to heat up the room. It's also famous because Kemal Ataturk died there in 1938. He died in the palace. And the palace also has a nice park that you can stroll through, even if you don't go inside. It has its own clock tower and its own elaborate mosque associated with it. So it's, again, it's a part of the city that not everybody goes to, but it's certainly a nice part to walk around in. Here's Istanbul University. I had to show you a Turkish toilet just to remind you that they do exist. Most places that you stay, if you were to go to stay in a hotel or anything like that, are going to have Western style toilets, but Turkish toilets are actually very efficient and remarkably clean because you don't have to actually touch anything or sit on them. So if you're comfortable squatting or standing, you'll find them everywhere. This is another of the mosques for one of Suleiman's princes with a different kind of interior to it. And some of the old, very early era, Roman era ruins. This was an aqueduct that fed water supply to the city. Another more modern monument from the 20th century. And I'm going to end the program at a mosque that hardly anybody goes to, just because it's probably because at this point you've seen too many mosques, but also because it's in way over on the western part of the city in a fairly conservative neighborhood that not many people bother to go to. But it is one of the earliest mosques in the city, which makes it a little bit different, built in the late 1400s. So we're talking a good 2 centuries before Suleiman came along. And it was one of the first imperial mosques. So it's an enjoyable place to see, again, a less touristy part of the city. You will probably be one of very few non-locals wandering around here. And the interior is just incredible. It has far more windows than a lot of the other mosques that we've seen. So it's the light streaming in from all 4 sides is just gorgeous. And the decoration, of course, is also fantastic. It has its own cemetery, as most of the mosques do, which is also very pretty. And you can just sort of enjoy some of the street life as you stroll around the neighborhood. This was actually a library, believe it or not. Not currently, but was in the past used as a library. And just some of the mix of things that you'll see if you peek around a corner. So I'm going to end the program there. I guess we're just on time. I will stop my share and we can take a look and see if anybody has any questions that I missed. We talked about the mosaics. Oh, what is the name of the hotel I stayed in? You know, I don't remember, but I would have to double check. And even if I remembered which one it was, there are so many hotels in that part of where we stayed in the oldest part of the city that I don't think you could go wrong if you just read some reviews in guidebooks or online. There's a lot of those kinds of small guest houses, many of which have roof terraces like ours did. And they're far less expensive than a lot of the big international hotels. So I would definitely recommend staying in that part of town because everything is going to be within like a 10-minute walk of where you want to go. But if you want to email me, I could probably dig out the exact name of what it was and see if it's still there. This was a few years ago, so who knows whether it's still in operation. How safe is it for single women? Again, I think in general, you are probably, in many Muslim countries, surprisingly, single women are actually very safe because of the culture. As a Western woman alone, I would be careful, certainly be careful at night. I would be careful at night anyway. I think walking alone, the biggest problem I would say in Istanbul is probably not violent crime. Pickpocketing, like any big busy tourist city, is always a problem. So you should just be careful of your belongings and not try to stand out with wearing expensive jewelry and stuff like that. I think far more likely to be a problem is just excessively aggressive people trying to sell you stuff. And they will be extremely friendly, extremely accommodating, and they'll follow you and try to ingratiate themselves onto you. And there isn't really a danger to that, but it can be annoying, and you need to be good about being able to set boundaries and say, no, thank you, very firmly, and just keep going. Because they usually, probably, I think the most likely thing that's going on is they're trying to steer you to a particular store where they're going to try to con you into buying things or going to a certain restaurant. It's not necessarily any kind of danger, but it's just annoying. So I would make sure that you go in with your best boundary setting tactics already in line, and I think you'd be fine. What else did I miss? Did that one? Are there churches left? Well, really, no. There are churches, but as you've seen, places like the Hora Church and Hagia Sophia they were built as churches and spent most of their history as churches, but they are no longer used as churches. So yes, you will see a lot of old Byzantine era buildings, but they are no longer used as churches. There is a small Christian population in Istanbul, although for the most part it's Orthodox as opposed to Roman Catholic. So there's a small population of mostly Greek or Eastern Orthodox, but not very many. So most of what you're going to be seeing is mosques, definitely. Are there many American Western chain restaurants? Oh, yeah. Although not too many. You certainly won't feel overwhelmed by that. But oh, yeah, you'll find Kentucky Fried Chicken and stuff like that. I'm sure there's a Starbucks somewhere. But I don't remember feeling overwhelmed by that because there's just so much. Istanbul is just, there's so much coming at you. Your senses are overwhelmed that things like a McDonald's will definitely get lost in the swirl of other things that are going on. So you definitely won't feel it the same way. Definitely not the way I would say I have felt in other European countries, or for example, a place like Dubai, which is also a Muslim country, but you go to one of the shopping centers in Dubai and it's like going to Burlington Mall. You'll see all the same things that you can see here. I don't remember feeling quite that way in Istanbul. Did I pay to use the public toilets? I don't think so. I definitely don't think so. Why is green an important color? I don't know the why of that. That's another thing I would have to look up. Green is just has always been a very important symbolic color throughout the whole history of Islam. And I don't know if there's a particular historical or symbolic reason. I'm sure there is, but I don't happen to know what it is. I'd have to look it up. Are there best times of the year to visit? No, yeah, spring and fall, I would say, would be the best. Like a lot of other places in the Mediterranean, the weather in the winter can be a little clammy and cold. They don't get horribly cold the way we would here, but it snows there on occasion. Not a lot, but the best times I would say to go would be in the spring or fall when the temperature is a little bit more moderate. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. But almost any time of year is okay there, I think. But if I were to pick, I would recommend spring or fall, just because the weather I think is better. I was there in, I think that, let's see, I was there once in the spring, like in April, and I think the most recent time I was there was in September or October, and both times were very nice in terms of the temperature and the humidity and all of that. Let's see, what else? Someone mentioned that getting steered to certain shops happens on tours too. Yes, oh yeah. You can take all kinds of tours. You can take tours of the whole, you can have a whole tour of your entire stay in the city, or you can take little day trips, or you can hire an individual guide to take you around. I don't think that's really necessary unless you're a very timid traveler. But if you're really timid, you're probably not in Istanbul anyway. I think Istanbul is a perfectly good place for you to just explore on your own. I think it's fine. The language, English, will get you pretty much everywhere. I think you'd be fine as an independent traveler there without a tour. And let's see, what else? Oh, somebody also mentioned the Turkish baths in Hungary. Yes, I just did a program. I forget which library I did it for. I'm not sure if it was you guys or a different library, but I did one on Budapest. And yes, because of course Budapest was also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was influenced by the Ottomans. Many parts of Eastern Europe have a tradition of Turkish-style baths and still do today. Budapest is one of the places that still has a really strong tradition. And you can do it there, but definitely in Istanbul and all over Turkey, there are all kinds of places where you can do those kinds of traditional baths. And I think, have I got everything? But yes, Charles King's books. What other books would I recommend? I can't think of any off the top of my head. There's a couple of really good biographies, which the specific names escape me. But again, if you email me, I could probably dig them out for you. Of Suleiman the Magnificent, and also Roxolana, because that was probably one of the most, it was sort of the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. And there's also a number of good histories about the Byzantine Empire and also the sacking of Constantinople when Mehmet came in. I can't think of any specific titles right now, but if you're interested in that history, those are the big time periods that I think are the most interesting, is the history of Byzantium, the history of the conquering of the city in 1453, the golden age during Suleiman, and then the end of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20s, or at the end of World War I. I think those are the key periods where the history is the most intriguing, I think, and the most interesting. So feel free, actually, I'm going to put, again, at mail.com. I just put my email into the chat. So if anybody has any additional questions, do feel free to email me and I'll see. I'll look into some of these questions and get back to you or make recommendations. If you have any other questions, I'm always happy to answer questions that way as well.
Jeff, I'll make sure to include your email in the email
Okay.
address in the email everyone receives tomorrow.
I did just see, because I closed another window and saw there were a couple of, in the chat, there were a couple of additional questions. I mentioned the synagogue, is it in use? Yes, it is. But as you can imagine, the congregation population of Jews in Istanbul these days is much smaller than it was in historic times. But yes, it's still active. Did you have an opportunity to visit Turkic carpet shops and see how they are dyed and made? Oh, absolutely. In fact, it is very difficult to go to Istanbul and not be dragged into a Turkish carpet shop. So it's also very hard to do that and not come out with a Turkish carpet. So be careful of whether you actually are interested in that or not. I actually do like Turkish carpets, and if you go with the idea that you don't have to sell me, I am going to buy a Turkish carpet, but leave me alone, you will actually probably have a better experience if you're just honest with them and say, you don't need to drag me to a particular store. I am interested in one. This is what I'm willing to spend. Let's talk. You'll probably have a better experience. But oh yeah, you will meet people on the street who will be practically dragging you into their store because you can't leave Istanbul without a carpet.
So Jeff, I think you have answered all.
I think questions. I got them all.
I think you did a very thorough job of getting them all. There was a lot.
So let's give like Jeff I said, if I missed anybody, shoot me an email.
Yeah. Let's give Jeff a big virtual round of applause for his presentation and the Q&A. We're going to see Jeff again next month. Let me get this correct. It's going to be on Tuesday, February 14th. Is that Valentine's Day, Jeff? I think Jeff's going to be spending his Valentine's Day morning with us.
I don't care about Valentine's Day, so it's fine with me.
Well, we're going to northern Sicily. Perhaps that's romantic, right?
Oh,
so that's,
it is. Oh, yeah. Oh, you'll love Sicily's great. You'll love that one.
So Sicily on Tuesday, February 14th, and that one's going to start at 11 o'clock Eastern, not 10:30. So folks, I'll look for an email for me by tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual armchair travel presentations. I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
All right, Jeff, looking forward to it. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye, everyone.